Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon if you are in the United States. Welcome to the 2022 Massena Society Conference, which is hosted jointly by Louisiana State University in Shreveport and High Point University. I am Alex Mikaberidze. I'm a professor of history and in Ruth Herring Noel Endowed Chair at Louisiana State University in Shreveport. And I'm delighted to welcome you all. And knowing the program, I can say that I can welcome you from all across the world. Truly, we have participants from as far as New Zealand, from France, from Britain, from Russia, and so many other places. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, this evening, or this morning in case of some of you. I'm truly delighted to see you all. The Massena Society is an institution that was organized several years ago to promote scholarship, promote study of the Revolutionary era, broadly defined. But we focus in terms of kind of interest. We explore a period from 1789 to 1815, but not limited to Europe, but to essentially emphasize the global ramifications of the revolutionary transformations that took place during this era. Today, I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues for the opening of this conference, and I want to introduce first and foremost my colleague and good friend, Victor Massena. Here you are, Victor. Victor Andre Massena, Prince of Essling, is a direct descendant of the great Marshal Andre Massena. He had an esteemed career in the French diplomatic service. He served on several missions on behalf of the French government. And he is also the honorary president of the Massena Society. So without further ado, I want to let Victor share some of his remarks with us.
Thank you, Alexander. It's really kind of you to introduce me this in such a nice way. First of all, I would like to say that waiting for this conference to start, I was moved by this picture of our old friend Don. One remark I will make is that he was not wearing on this picture the Legion of Honor he rightly deserved. It was given to him by the Chancellor of the Order at West Point in due, and he really deserved it. So let's imagine him with his Legion of Honor, and as I said, very well deserved. He created the Massena Society out of the souvenir of his works on Pelé, which was his master work on the Portugal campaign, where Pelé worked with Massena, was on Massena's staff. And we met in those days, which was like, well, 50 something years ago. And we became very good friends. And just before this session started, we were remembering this man. I think we all loved him. This is the right word. We not only did we like him, but we loved him. And he was a marvelous man. And amongst the most important things with him is the way he could communicate his love of history, not only the Napoleonic period, not only the revolutionary period, but the actual importance of history in our lives. That, I think, is his very, very important legacy to us. So I dust of glory, yes, certainly, and we can re-examine, and it's worth always re-examining. There are many, many things to say about all these areas, revolutionary and the Napoleonic area. The one thing that fascinates me as president of the Fondation Napoleon in France, whatever, is the more things goes on, the more we discover topics that are worth studying and the importance of that period, not only of the man, but of the period of revolutionary and the Napoleonic era, the breakthrough, everything that was written about it. And it's really, really important. That, again, I think is, maybe it's the Massena Society, but there should be something special about Don. He should be, the sort of the man who created a lot of things, one of them being the Massena Society. So I'm looking forward to us meeting again. I hope next year, COVID being terminated, as they would have said, and that we can meet again. And I raise my glass quote to the memory of my good friend Don, and a special thought also for dear Annabelle, who was so important in his life and so nice with everybody, including his students, friends. That's all.
Cheers, cheers. Thank you so much for your kind remarks. I want to touch upon two issues quickly. One issue of logistics of holding a conference online like this, and the other one more of an announcements, because I know that there are a lot of participants here who will be presenters. And I want to let you know that Fondation Napoleon, of which Victor Massena is the president, Fondation Napoleon has launched a new initiative, and that is a new Napoleonic publication called Napoleonica La Revue, which is designed to serve as a platform for revolutionary and Napoleonic scholarship. And what makes this journal, it has already had quite success on the Kane International platform, but it was primarily Francophone. And the new initiative, which is just starting off, is oriented more for English-speaking world, for English-speaking audience. It will be a peer-review electronic periodical with a rather hefty, so to speak, scholarly editorial board drawn on scholars from all around the world. So if you have articles that you either present at this conference, or you have articles that you're working on the revolutionary and Napoleonic world, please consider Napoleonica La Revue, or Napoleonica the Journal, as it will be known in English, for a possible publication. And then the second issue is in terms of process. So we would like to ask all the participants of today's event to send questions that you may have at the, during the talk that Professor Rowe will give today. Send them in chat addressed to the moderator, Professor Frederick Schneid, and he will then moderate the debate at the end of the talk. So if you have a remark, if you have a comment or a question, just use the chat button, which is at the bottom of your screen, and will open a separate window on your right side, and type your question there. And we will do our best to ask all the questions that will be incoming. My next person is really needs no introductions in that sense, because he is an esteemed Napoleonic scholar. Professor Frederick Schneid is the head of the history department at the High Point University. He has written extensively on the history of Napoleonic era, especially history of Napoleonic kingdom in Italy. And he is here today as my co-host, as the person who played a crucial role in organizing this year's conference, and as a person who will introduce our keynote speaker. Frederick?
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure for us to co-host this wonderful conference. The success of last year's conference was truly remarkable, and I hope that we have the same type of success this year, and so far so good, 9 minutes in. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Michael Rowe is reader in European history at King's College London. He received his PhD at Cambridge University and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. His research is concentrated on Europe, with particular expertise in the history of France and Germany. And among his publications are From Reich to State, which is on Napoleonic Germany, excellent book, and Collaboration, Resistance in Napoleonic Europe. He also jointly edited the volume War, Demobilization, and Memory, The Legacy of War in the Era of Atlantic Revolutions. Dr. Rowe is currently working on a book, Napoleon's World, which looks at the world as seen from the perspective of Napoleon. And I think in addition to this, this wonderful career of scholarship, Dr. Rowe has a very interesting relationship to the Napoleonic era. Interestingly enough, he originally got into the Napoleonic history as a student when he learned that one of his ancestors fought under Napoleon as a trooper in the 13th Chasseurs Cheval. So that's a pretty good pedigree right there. So Professor Rowe, have at it.
Thanks very much, Rick. I take it I'm coming through loud and clear. Yeah, good. Well, thanks, Rick. Thanks, Alex, for extending. Well, it's an honor to be asked to give this first keynote. Thanks also to the Massena Society, to Louisiana State University, Shreveport, and High Point University for acting as hosts. Yeah, I'll start with a quote. A man like me troubles himself little about the lives of a million men. It's been attributed to Napoleon, that quote. Maybe he said it. Metternich, Austria's foreign minister, said he said it to him during this very famous meeting, which takes place in Dresden in June 1813. Probably the final chance that Napoleon had to extract a kind of peace from the Allied powers, which would have preserved the natural frontiers of France. It's a pretty horrible thing to have said, or to have been alleged to have said. And I suppose whatever the truth, it is plausible that Napoleon might have said it. Maybe a million is something of an exaggeration, but one of the keys to the success of Napoleon and his wars was the steady stream, or rather flood, of recruits. And if one adds up the numbers of these various levies between March 1800 ending in November 1813, one arrives at the startling figure of 2,476,000 conscripts. I think what is even more significant in many ways is that half of these, so 1.29 million of those, are mobilized in the final 14 months of this time frame. So that's starting in September 1812. So that's the month, of course, which witnesses Borodino and the occupation of Moscow. I'm a bit sorry that Rick kind of stole my thunder a little bit, because I'm going to reference my great-great-great-grandfather, a certain Peter Rederscheidt. I guess today he would be categorized a German. Maybe he saw himself as such. He was born in Cologne in May 1787. And for a segment of his life, he became French legally. Cologne, the rest of the region, the left bank of the Rhine, were occupied by France in 1794, so before Napoleon. And then administratively integrated into France in 1798. And integration means the extension of French military conscription. And this roped in Peter Rederscheidt sometime after December 1806. That's that month, December 1806, saw the mobilization of about 80,000 conscripts throughout the French Empire from a class of 1807. Of course, 1807 is that point in time where the empire of Napoleon is said to have reached its apogee. It's at the pinnacle. It's in a process of defeating the Prussians and the Russians. It's just defeated the Austrians in 1805. It's, of course, before the Spanish nightmare, which starts in 1808. Britain, of course, remains undefeated, and in many ways therein lies the rub. Britain is unchallenged at sea after Trafalgar, and Britain is able to leverage in the rest of the world in its struggle against France. And most obviously, this leveraging includes raising land forces overseas. Often when one measures the size of a British army, one doesn't include the East India Company army, which is at various points, is close to 200,000 men. It leverages in both its imperial and non-imperial overseas territories for crucial war materials. India, one should not forget, was the world's most important source of saltpeter in the Napoleonic Wars. And Britain, through its financial institutions and hard-won in the 18th century creditworthiness, has the capacity to leverage in the future by taking out loans. Some of them, believe it or not, were finally paid off only in 2015. So I guess that means that I've been leveraged in as a UK taxpayer in 2015 as part of this kind of war effort. Napoleonic France, of course, in contrast, can't leverage in the future. The vast majority of its war expenditure is covered by taxation and reparations from defeated enemies, not from loans. Places like Amsterdam, a traditional lender to states, witnessed capital flight to London as a consequence of Napoleonic rule. Now, I'm sure that my ancestor Peter Ridderscheit was oblivious as to why British naval and financial power made victory of his own side unlikely. As he headed off to his unit, as Rick said, the 13th Chasseurs à Cheval, a light cavalry regiment. Regimental history indicates he would have been in Spain, I think, for much of the time after 1808, and that was a theatre which played to British strengths. It's where naval power and the capacity to project and sustain relatively small but effective expeditionary force far from home is really crucial. For a time, the 13th Chasseurs à Cheval formed part of a brigade commanded by somebody I guess is going to be familiar to many of you, François Fournier-Salovez. And as part of his brigade, the regiment distinguished itself at the Battle of Fuentes de Honoro in May 1811. Fournier, I've always found, has been a sort of interesting character. In many ways, he epitomizes those qualities that made the French army so formidable. He was brave to the extent of foolhardy, violent, aggressive, tenacious, imbued with a sense of personal honor, extreme even by the standards of La Grande Armée. Of course, he's been immortalized by Antoine Gros in a painting which hangs in the Louvre. And he's also the inspiration for one of the characters in Joseph Conrad's The Duel. For film buffs, the Fournier character is, of course, played by Harvey Keitel in Ridley Scott's film adaptation. In my opinion, the best film I should add on the character of Napoleon's army. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. Fournier, he spectacularly falls out with Napoleon immediately after the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813. Fournier mishandles his own troops in the battle, but what really annoys Napoleon is Fournier's defeatism following the defeat. And Leipzig was indeed a turning point, a point, I would say, of no return, at least so long as the Allies remained united, which they did. I mean, exactly what happened to my ancestor, Peter Ridderscheit, in those final campaigns is unclear. He might have fought on until the armistice was concluded with the Allies in April 1814. This was then the army of Louis XVIII already. Napoleon abdicated. Maybe he deserted before then, as did many new Frenchmen, those Italians, Belgians, Dutch and Germans who had been incorporated into the empire. Many of them desert in the final months of 1813 and early 1814. Certainly the French military leadership suspects the loyalty of new Frenchmen, as they're called, to the extent of disarming some complete regiments where they were preponderant. What I do know is that after Napoleon's fall and exile, that Peter Ridderscheit, like so many veterans, both within old France and beyond, fell for the Napoleonic legend. His native Cologne became Prussian in 1815, but this didn't prevent him and other veterans of Napoleon's army from openly celebrating their prior service. And they did this within veterans associations. And Ridderscheit's admission certificate into such an association in Cologne survives. It's dated the 15th of August, 1844. Of course, The 15th of August is Napoleon's birthday. And on the certificate, you find an engraving of Napoleon in the clouds, illuminated from behind by the sun's rays and surrounded with images of battles. A few years later, Cologne's veterans raised enough funds to erect a memorial in Cologne's main cemetery, Massena itself laid out as part of the town planning reforms initiated under French rule. And this memorial is dedicated, and I quote, to the memory of the warriors of Napoleon's armies native to Cologne who fell far from their home. I mean, Liberated is evidence of one of the Grande Armée's strengths, its high morale, and this morale is supranational, it extends beyond the frontiers of old France. In many ways, it's personal, it's focused on Napoleon. In the words of another German-speaking veteran from the Rhineland, Karl Scheer, we loved all our officers, from sergeant to field marshal. The emperor, however, we viewed as a superior being. The problem, though, is that this sentiment did not extend to Liberate's civilian relatives and acquaintances, at least not if a large pile of other evidence is to be believed. For what is striking about the Napoleonic Empire in places like the Rhineland, regions which formed the Inner Empire core that Mike Brewers has written so eloquently about, is how little resistance there was to the Allied invasion, which started in the early hours of the 1st of January 1814, when General Blücher led his forces across the Rhine at Kaub. Now, Michael Legier's, he's going to be delivering tomorrow's keynote, and he's published in great detail and authority on the campaigns in Germany in 1813 and the campaign in France of 1814, which in many ways was an extension of the 1813 campaign. And I'm not going to dare invade this particular terrain. That's for Michael tomorrow. What I can do is speak about the atmosphere in these French frontier departments in the Rhineland, notably when they were invaded. And this atmosphere could be described as one of sullen defeatism, at least, or at best, and outright hostility to Napoleonic rule at worst. And it's within this environment that the overstretched and outnumbered French army was expected to operate. French revolutionaries in the 1790s, notably Danton, had argued very powerfully for natural frontiers marked out by nature, by which he meant broad rivers like the Rhine and oceans like the Atlantic and mountains like the Pyrenees. These were most conducive to being defended and in many ways a kind of an insurance for international peace. Natural frontiers were applicable universally. But 1813, I think, shows that natural features were trumped by popularly held historical and cultural affiliations. They couldn't be overcome, those affiliations, by natural frontiers. French troops gazing over the Rhine in those last weeks of 1813 might have been comforted by the expanse of water that separated them from the advancing Allies. But at their backs, there was a broad strip of territory, quite a broad strip of territory full of people hostile towards them and people who expected them to lose and who indeed hoped that they would lose. Now, how did this hostility manifest itself in sort of more practical terms? Well, one thing there was not was some mass Drennish uprising as the Allies advanced. There was what I would call low-level resistance, and this was, I think, debilitating. It included providing assistance to Allied reconnaissance and raiding parties that started crossing the Rhine, and this starts really in early 1813, early December 1813, that is a month before the main invasion led by Blücher further to the south. One of the most serious episodes occurs in the town of Neuss, which is located on the River Rhine, on the banks. It's about 20 miles downriver, so that's north of Cologne. On the 2nd of December 1813, it finds itself raided, Neuss, by a Prussian force estimated at about 1,500 troops strong. And in many ways, what's interesting is that locals act as guides, pointing out the houses of French officers, whilst others, locals that is, pillage the homes of tax collectors. And you get inhabitants from outside of Neuss, from surrounding villages, who go on the rampage. They demolish customs post. Further south of Neuss, Prussian forces that cross over the river are accompanied by large numbers of local peasants hunting customs men. And according to reports from the French civilian and military authorities, the authorities in Neuss are simply too afraid of popular retribution to stop, to halt this kind of activity. Significant is the prevalence of customs men of douaniers as choice targets for local insurgents. I think it highlights the importance of Napoleon's continental system in turning frontier departments against the regime. And this extended back earlier than early 1813. It's not really to do with a defeat in Russia or Leipzig. This sort of hostility really builds from about 1810 onwards, when Napoleon issues further decrees, the Trianon Decree notably, which tighten legislation, banning British imports, also the imports coming in through neutral channels via the United States merchant navy. And after 1810, the enforcement of the continental system blocking out Britain becomes much more effective. And we have a very good source on this. Merchants, smugglers, they're the same thing really in this period, in this environment. They insure themselves, they insure their goods, their wares from the threat of being seized. And one gets a fairly good sense of how well Napoleonic enforcement of the customs barrier is doing by simply looking at the insurance rates. And in lax years, you might be even into single figures. But by 1810 and 1811, you're talking about 40% of the actual value of a commodity. That is what your insurance premium is. So the enforcement is becoming very effective. And of course, the actual line is the Rhine River, which is a formidable customs barrier. There are attempts to shift the barrier in places like the Grand Duchy of Berg, where you haven't got those kind of geographical obstacles, and the insurance rates sort of drop. So in many ways, you can set a frontier by looking at sort of insurance premiums, and the Rhine is where you should have it if you're trying to block out British imports. So Napoleon is beginning to win the economic war against the British in 1810. 1811. I don't know how long Britain could have sustained the pain, but the price that Napoleon pays is the alienation of his own subjects, and nowhere more than in the frontier departments. Especially kind of powerful image of these years, 1810, 1811, the final years of the empire, these pyres, funeral pyres, if you like, of confiscated merchandise, which are torched by the French customs authority, who seize them. And these pyres, they extend from the Hanseatic departments and their great cities, Bremen, Hamburg in the north, through the Dutch departments, places like Amsterdam, and then through the Rhineland, places like Cologne and Mainz further to the south, Koblenz, all the way down to the south, to the Alps. And it really is an image which was very powerful for contemporaries. It's immortalized in various prints, and it's referred to in some correspondences and also in police reports on public opinion. I think it is fair to assume, it's not proved, but I think it is fair to assume that a proportion of the scouts assisting in that Allied raid on Neuss and other sort of forays were boatmen, Drennish boatmen, forced into smuggling by the tightening of the Rhine tariff barrier, which increasingly separates the French Empire's economy from the world beyond and the world beyond the river. The river, of course, had under the old regime been sort of an economically integrated whole. There'd been a lot of trans-riverine traffic, and of course those fairly natural kind of connections across the river, well, they've been cut, and that's caused hardship, and it's caused unemployment, and it's caused unemployed boatmen, and it's caused a sort of parallel economy, a black economy of smuggling, which is partly serviced, of course, by deserters and by draft dodgers who find it hard to make a living legally. And it's as people like Roger Dufresne has written about, this sort of black economy involves really the whole segment, the spectrum of the local population, from bankers, from the wealthiest in the department, people like Abraham Schaffhausen, to poor people, and to people in between, to tavern owners who are especially important in kind of hosting, storing wares, and as operating as kind of like operational hubs for smuggling operations. So I think the continental system is important in all of this. Elsewhere, far from Neuss, far from where the Allied forces actually make an appearance in these final weeks of 1813, there is an upsurge in threats and actual violence against people deemed close to the Napoleonic regime. And if you go through kind of police reports, official reports from the prefectural authorities, it's really in about December 1812 that this upsurge of violence begins. And I think it must be the news of the catastrophe that Napoleon has suffered in Russia. This is when you start to get things like seditious posters appearing, threatening graffiti being scrawled on official buildings, and indeed on the private dwellings of people somehow associated with French rule, maybe local mayors who have made themselves perhaps unpopular by being a little bit overzealous in following the letter of the law. So this kind of demoralization of the French civilian authorities in the Rhineland really sets in well before Leipzig. Of course, Leipzig makes it much worse. Leipzig is a battle where various German contingents, they defect, they go over from the French side to the Allies, and very quickly afterwards you get this kind of domino effect, this collapse of satellite states across the Rhine, Westphalia and Berg, states which had suffered greatly as a consequence of the continental system, worse than the Rhineland. They're on the wrong side of the tariff barrier. And of course, Westphalia, sometimes referred to as Napoleon's model kingdom, disappears really overnight. It collapses very quickly. It's an artificial creation. People don't feel an attachment towards it. So in late 1813, and its collapse then creates a wave of French refugees who stream through the frontier departments across the Rhine westwards, so heading towards old France, and that's utterly demoralizing on the left bank of the Rhine. This stream of humanity is accompanied by a flood of propaganda material moving in the same direction. Pamphlets, fly sheets produced by nationalist writers, journalists, people like Ernst Moritz Arndt and Joseph Goeres, a native of Koblenz. They produce this material in partnership with a sponsorship of elements within the Prussian government. And this is also very worrying for the French authorities. They report back to Paris. You get actually a very ironic, I would call it, inversion of what had happened in the 1790s, a quarter of a century earlier. It's now the French who are accusing the Allies of aiding and abetting revolution. They use that word revolution in a negative sense, and of the Napoleonic empires being the bastion of legality and order. So a complete reversal of the 1790s. The extent to which this extensive, well-organized, well-funded propaganda undermines the will to resist, I think that's hard to gauge. I think at one level it's unprovable. The French authorities are worried about it. The Prussian authorities think it's worth investing in. Its impact we don't really know definitively. Of course, you have to set it against other factors which are fairly devastating to morale in the frontier departments. And I think, top on the list there, probably preceding now, the continental system, Allied propaganda, the site of sort of refugees, are these frequent mobilizations of additional classes of conscripts. Especially damaging for morale are those levies which draw on previous classes, despite promises made earlier that they were now exempt from further military obligations. That was especially unpopular. I think in second place in unpopularity is the October 1813 levy of 160,000 men who would reach the age of 20 only in 1815. So this premature mobilization of people who are still 18 at the point of that decree. The rich, of course, as ever, the very rich managed to find a way out of this through the purchase of replacements. That had always been an industry which was actually quite well developed in the Rhineland with its sort of commercial traditions, its sort of insurance schemes against smuggling. Well, you could insure yourself in a way against being pulling an unlucky number out of a hat to an urn when it came to the conscription process, so you could purchase a replacement. One prominent person actually purchased as a replacement in this period is David Hunsemann, who is quite well known for historians of Germany. He becomes a Prussian finance minister during the 1848 revolutions. Well, his father purchased a replacement for him for just over 4,000 francs to get his son out of service in 1813. So much higher sum than in previous years. Typically, it'd been about 1,500, maybe 2,000 francs. Something else which I think is interesting, and this is reflected in the various contracts which you can see in the notarial archives in Düsseldorf for this region. These contracts where people purchase replacements are stipulations in 1813. You increasingly get them that the payment should be made in foreign currency and not in French francs. So there's obviously a lack of belief at this stage that the France, the Napoleonic France, the empire is going to continue long term. Its prospects seem to look very bleak if people don't trust your money anymore. Of course, this sort of replacement industry, that's the wealthy, the vast majority. In 1813, indeed earlier, they can't afford those kind of sums. A worker can sustain a family maybe on 500 francs a year, so 4,000 francs is way above that. So they need to resort to other methods of escape. And another good source for Cologne in this period is the correspondence of the Boise Brothers. They're natives of Cologne. They're famous actually for their work in creating one of the world's premier medieval art collections, housed now in Munich. They, in late 1813, are corresponding with each other, the two brothers, Sulpice and Melchior, about how to get to Switzerland, which is to where they want to escape. Many of their friends have done so, is what they refer to in their letters. So there's obviously something going on there. Difficult to get a passport, mind you. A more drastic solution, a tragic solution, but one I think which reflects the kind of rather dire state of opinion in Cologne is is somebody committing suicide in the middle of the main square in the Neumarkt, shooting himself in the head. That's reported in the prefectural correspondence back to the Ministry of Interior. Why does he do it? We don't quite know, but it's possible that this is a young conscript who doesn't want to be mobilized. It does point to a sense of desperation, and whatever the reasons, it adds to that kind of sense of crisis and indeed a sort of meltdown, I think, in Cologne in these final stages of the empire. And then, of course, there's a problem of those new Frenchmen who've already been mobilized, who are actually serving within the French army, maybe who've been serving for several years, whose loyalty the regime no longer trusts as the tide of war turns decisively in the autumn 1813. According to one report by General Etienne Astrel de Rivedoux, who's the Director General of Military Conscription at that point, he writes a report to General Henri Clark, who's of course Minister of War, dated 12th of October 1813, so that's just before Leipzig. According to this letter, this report, about a fifth, 20% of Drennish conscripts had in fact deserted to enemy forces. Now, whether this is true and based on some deep sort of empirical study and evidence, I think that's impossible to verify. I haven't verified it, but it's a high proportion. And I think it, in many ways, more important is that the French army thinks that it is true, or at least thinks it might be true, to the extent that they start disarming and interning new French conscripts. And as Napoleon himself writes, as he's passing through the fortress of Mainz in early November 1813, he writes, he does not judge it appropriate to entrust the defense of the frontier to new Frenchmen. You know, these people have been French for, the better part of 20 years. Is he right to be worried? Possibly. Of course, you also get this issue of self-fulfilling prophecies, and I think Napoleon's attitude there does remind me a little bit of what I remember reading in Günther Rothenberg's book on the army of Austria-Hungary, the army of Franz Josef, at the time of the First World War, that the actual officers themselves start to suspect their men, those from non-German, non-Hungarian minorities, so their Czechs and their Italians, of being disloyal, and in many ways it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. These men are often actually loyal to the emperor, but because of suspicion, they become disloyal. That's something I think we need to factor in. Of course, the empire's Rhine frontier, well, that's breached in January 1814, as already mentioned, and the whole edifice of a Napoleonic state crashes down, and almost overnight. And I guess when I was sort of setting pen to paper to write this presentation, I had in mind, the collapse in Afghanistan in August last year, how a regime can sort of disappear very quickly. And of course, more recently, we're looking at Ukraine, and one wonders, to what extent does resistance get sustained? What are the kind of factors you need for resistance? Why do some nuts prove very hard to crack and others not? And certainly the Rhine departments, things look more like Afghanistan in many ways. It only takes the rumor of the presence of Cossacks, who, if those rumors are to be believed, are everywhere, for natives of old France serving within the administration to just pack up and leave. Their Rhenish colleagues, of course, stay. They don't leave. They've got nowhere else to go. And they run the administration. They just take over, run the administration for the benefit of the Allies, whose advance into France is thereby facilitated. I mean, I guess that's an irony. The French administration has been very well constructed. It has been perfected. It is great at resource mobilization. And that sort of structure is then handed over, and it benefits the Allies who move forward. Civic guards, appear spontaneously in places like Cologne, other cities, other towns, and they provide law and order. They just spare Allied troops the need to police their conquests, or at least to do all the policing of their conquests. Sitting above this kind of structure now in I guess we have to call it Allied occupied territory, you've got this inter-Allied central administration headed by Prussia's former prime minister, the Freiherr vom Stein. And this works, it's got some imperfections. They're roused the military commanders on the Allied side, but it does a fairly good job in mobilizing supplies for the Allied forces. Nationalist agitators, there's people like Arndt and Goerres, I've already mentioned, they complain that these new Frenchmen, Rhinelanders, haven't contributed sufficiently to the war effort by actually rising up and fighting against the French. I think that was always unrealistic. But in many ways, that kind of hostile non-cooperation, which had been there for much of 1813, was in many ways quite effective, I think. It was quite effective. It was demoralizing. It was demoralizing, especially for the French civil administration, which then collapses, pretty much overnight. I conclude this paper with a nod to my former teacher, Richard Overy, who taught at King's College London, where I was also a student as well as now a teacher. And Richard Overy might be familiar to some of you as an author of numerous books on the Second World War. And it's to one of these, Why the Allies Won, that I owe the title of this presentation. Overy and I also, I don't deny that other factors such as the balance of resources available to belligerents, so population, GDP, that's very important. The quality of leadership, that's important. Decisions about the allocation of resources is important. And also, we have to factor in the significance of chance and of simple luck in determining the outcome of battles that, prove decisive. But Overy also devotes a whole chapter in that book, Why the Allies Won, to the moral dimension of war, the feeling or the lack of it within a belligerent that one is fighting for a just cause or not. And my contention is that in the frontier departments of the French Empire, those very departments which should have formed a formidable glacis facing the Rhine, such a sentiment did not exist in 1813. So people like my great-great-great-grandfather were, if you like, an unrepresentative minority. Concluding sentence, one reason why the Allies won was that there weren't really enough of them, people like the young Reederscheid. Anyway, I think I'll conclude there to leave time for questions and I hope answers. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that wonderful presentation to open our second annual Massena Society conference. I'll ask those who are in attendance, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I will be happy to read them and have Professor Rowe respond. Unless there's something wrong with my chat, I don't see any questions yet. Remember to send to me. Send chat to. Okay, hold on here. Okay, well, I am getting question now. So if you have questions, a few people have sent me test chats. One question that came up, the town you mentioned, Neuss, how do you spell that?
So that's N-E-U-S-S.
There you go. Thank you.
That was an easy one. Yeah.
Other questions? So let me ask you a question while everyone is thinking of a question. You mentioned the East India Company's troops that often are not included in the British military forces. Can you talk a little bit about that more? Because that is something that I've never thought about.
Yeah, I mean, about 200,000. So, that makes them roughly the size of the British Army, depending when you count. And they are starting to be deployed outside of India. So they're not just fighting other sort of like Indian princes, but they're starting to be deployed to the Middle East, which is interesting. And they're starting to be deployed to the Dutch East Indies, which of course are taken over by Britain when Napoleon annexes the Netherlands in 1810. So in a way, this is the beginning, I guess, of a pattern which you see throughout the 19th and, really all the way through to the Second World War. This reliance upon what in many ways is, becomes the largest westernized army in Asia, not counting the Russian army, which I treat as essentially a European army, which is where it tends to operate and be based. So India is important, and something I didn't realize, until recently was the importance of India, especially that area around Bengal, for the production of saltpeter. That's absolutely massive. You can also talk about the beginnings of an Indian shipbuilding industry. So, for example, HMS Asia, which is a British flagship at the Battle of Navarino, the last naval battle with sailing ships in 1827. That's been built in Bombay. And in many ways, they're of superior quality, because of teak being used, which is this wonderful wood, which kind of, when it's exposed to water, just expands. So it creates a kind of hull, which is almost as if it's been hewn out of a single kind of piece of wood. And it's kind of, it's more resistant to worms and things like that. So India is starting to be, I think, more important. And I think it's in many ways underappreciated as an asset on the British side.
We have a question from, thank you, by the way. Thank you for that. From Dr. Mike Benura. When the Allies occupied French regions and the administrations began working for the Allies, were they providing the same level of support they had been providing to the Imperial administration in Paris, or were they withholding resources? How effective were they in helping the Allied armies in comparison to how effective they were in the Imperial administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're actually very effective indeed in kind of, first of all, they provide law and order. And they do so with a certain amount of kind of assistance from the Allied forces, who quickly actually slap down any kind of attempts to have like kind of vendettas, to go into a kind of a setup where you're exacting revenge on some kind of douanier or anyone else for that matter. That really is crushed pretty much immediately. So, I mean, there isn't really a kind of like a law and order problem or a banditry problem. But these civic guards really help. They just police. They're not going to kind of invest a fortress like Mainz. That has to be done by Allied forces. It's going to be done by rear echelon forces, probably from the Confederation of the Rhine states. But they're not going to do that. But they're going to provide you a kind of a peaceful environment. And yeah, they mobilize. They mobilize vast amounts of kind of livestock. Of course, a lot of things have been taken from by the French, so but they mobilize really what they can. What they don't really do is mobilize troops. And I think there's a certain kind of legalism which comes here. You haven't had the first Treaty of Paris. This is still technically French territory. You do not kind of introduce conscription in enemy occupied territory. But yeah, I mean, I think Stein actually, I think he runs a fairly good system, and some of his subordinates are actually Prussians from the Rhineland. They've got their roots there, but they'd left that region in the 1790s when the French come in. So they got kind of local connections. So these are not they might look like outsiders at first sight, but often they're not. They've got kind of those local connections which smooth things along. So I think it's a success story. It's a kind of like a bit of a model of how things could be done, actually.
Well, that question was very good for leading into this question by Ryan Diamond. When the Allies do liberate or occupy these Drennish territories, to what extent are they treated as occupied French territories or liberated German territories? And does that vary between the Prussians and Russians, for example, or the Austrians, for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one because, of course, the Rhineland itself is previously been a bit of a patchwork of territories. It hadn't been a single territory before French rule, that is, and bits of it had been kind of Prussian, small bits, especially to the north, had been Prussian. Other bits had been independent states. Some of them had been, like Cologne, had been an imperial city, which meant that they were directly under the Habsburg emperor. So things tend to be easy where you've got your former sovereign kind of coming in. So if you're like in one of those former Prussian territories, although you haven't been Prussian in effect for about 20 years, when the Prussians come in, it does look more like a kind of liberation, especially for the older generation. This is our kind of like legitimate ruler back. This is kind of, our familiar ruler back. When it comes to the Austrians, that kind of works better in places which had been previously like imperial cities or Catholic. People are in fear of the Russians. They have got this reputation for kind of trashing wine cellars and for just kind of being disorderly. And there's this kind of incredible fear of Cossacks who just appear to be everywhere. There just couldn't have been that many of them. But maybe they move around, a lot, and which is what light cavalry is supposed to do. I guess it's supposed to kind of partly do scouting and policing supply lines. But I guess it has a really kind of good terror value as well, in that you just don't know where it's going to be popping up. And I think there's this kind of weird curiosity as well. So it's almost like, I guess as children, we remember sort of hiding behind a curtain or hiding behind a sofa watching a horror movie. And, we want to look at these kind of exotic sort of people from the East, but we're kind of at the same time sort of terrified of them. The Swedes seem to have a bad reputation, but I think that's partly, a lot of the kind of material I've been reading is sort of from the Prussian military, and they just absolutely hate the Swedes and Bernadotte, and so I think I don't necessarily believe all of that. I think those who do actually have a bad reputation, and this doesn't help the kind of German nationalist narrative, are those kind of Freikorps unit, Lutzow Freikorps, who have gone down in kind of German history as this kind of great sort of patriotic thing, but they seem to be actually quite nasty and sort of come in with the attitude that you're not proper Germans. We have to kind of re-Germanize you. You need to learn how to become German again. So there's a kind of like an agenda there, which I think grates a bit.
Graham asked, what was there a difference in support for the French or the Allies if we looked at the French cities or the countryside, right? Any different between the urban population and the rural population in terms of their support for Napoleon or their support for the Allies? Yeah,
I mean, that's a tricky one. I mean, I'm very much, impressed by a recent book by historian Pierre Horn, which some of you might know, and he writes about this region, and he goes a little bit further. He looks at Belgium, but he also looks at the old French departments. I think what's interesting about that book, well, the first thing is that despite the fact that technically all these departments are part of a French empire in 1813 and early 1814, these old kind of borders between old France and these new departments, they don't look as if they're there on a map. They just look like departmental borders, but these borders really are there. And as you cross them as an ally, you suddenly find yourself in old France. That's different. There you are the invader and you're resented. So that's one thing. That doesn't really address your question. But one thing which Pierre Horn does write a lot about is this sort of the fact that the French Empire really works best in a kind of urban setting. It's the urban areas which get kind of like a net spend, I guess, in their favor. whereas, the kind of conscripts, a disproportionate number of them, and the tax burden, falls on the rural population, where you don't get kind of much spending. So the empire, in many ways, if you just do a kind of like cost-benefit analysis, you're better off in an urban kind of center. That said, I think you get these weird differences. Somewhere like Cologne, I think, is less warm to the French for a variety of historical reasons. It's kind of right on the Rhine. It doesn't get anything better than a sub-prefecture. It doesn't, it gets its archbishop basically removed. It isn't even a bishopric in the, so there's kind of like a lot of, I think, civic pride, which has been hurt there. Whereas somewhere like Aachen or Aix-la-Chapelle, is where the prefecture is, that's slightly more positively inclined. So you get these kind of weird differences, and Bonn, I think, is seen as being maybe slightly more pro-French, and Cologne and Bonn are really rivals in this period, again, for reasons which go back to about the 13th century. So you sometimes get this kind of like overlay of attitudes towards the French, which are actually not so much about the French, but all these kind of like, regional, fairly local, and it looks like very much trivial kind of rivalries.
Thank you. Let me see here. This comes from Alex, not Alex Mikabridza, but a different Alex. Can you elaborate more on desertion in the Rhine departments? Can you compare to, let's say, previous, 1813, 1814 compared to previous years?
Yeah. I mean, we've got that wonderful source, haven't we? Hagenvilliers, the kind of like the tables which shows desertion and draft dodging. The French authorities obviously keep a very keen eye on this. And to be fair, the Rhenish departments do quite well, really up until early 1813. They're some of the better performers. I think the very early years you can't count because they have a disproportionately low kind of targets to hit when it comes to their quotas, and that's a deliberate policy. The 1798 law is only introduced, I think, in about 1803-4 there, and it's introduced lightly. So conscription only really gets going in about 1806-7, where then it starts to kind of exceed the target. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, if I were the minister of, responsible for the quotas, I wouldn't be particularly worried about the Rhenish departments up to late 1812, early 1813. They're actually doing okay. They're doing fine. They're doing fine, despite their kind of frontier location. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, you do get, something I write about in my Rhineland book. You do get a slightly higher instance, I think, of replacement and substitution. It's maybe twice the level of the old French departments. It's a very kind of commercial part of the world. People resolve problems there not necessarily by disappearing into the hills and becoming bandits, but through kind of financial mechanisms. So you get these kind of like insurance schemes where maybe people are not that well off come together and purchase a replacement. And you probably only need statistically one replacement for 3 people. That's going to be enough. So you kind of pool your resources. And maybe, the local mayor will produce a fake certificate, and you'll purchase somebody from across the Rhine, and make out that they're local. So there are these kind of workarounds, which in a way no one really loses from. The French army gets its soldiers, the local community spare somebody, and kind of everyone's happy, unless you get an official who's a stickler for doing everything correctly. But a lot of the prefects are happy with that.
Well, thank you. And it was Alex Grab who asked that question. He
Oh, good to hear from you, Alex.
Another question. How prevalent were the conditions you described in your presentation within the traditional borders of France?
Yeah, I mean, I think that changes. I think where you talk about Pierre Horn's book, I think then you start to get that kind of sullen resentment working against the Allies. I mean, I think there is a lot of resentment at the Napoleonic regime itself. And of course, old France is a bit of a patchwork between areas, especially the Atlantic seaboard, they'd suffered really very heavily as a result of continental system, and areas which are sort of more positive towards the regime. But I think the overall flavour is less positive, and of course, especially with Prussians, when they move across, then they do turn into a kind of more of a vengeful mood. I don't think you get real Prussian vengefulness in the Rhineland. It might not be agreeable, but they're not vengeful. But that does start to happen as they move forward into France, despite efforts of their command as well. Actually, not that many efforts to sort of temper some of this. But yeah, I mean, I think the continental system, the economic geography of France is important in this. And, never forget that the empire sort of falls apart really in the midst of an economic recession, which is set in earlier, and sort of coastal France, Bordeaux, North, the whole kind of area which had been based on the Atlantic economy, that's been hurting for some considerable time.
Okay, we have one more question. Could you talk about, this comes from, Claudio Mann. Could you talk about Napoleon's self-confidence during the 1814 campaign and its impact on the French ability to fight a defensive war?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, Napoleon's best campaign, I guess, at least after 1796, 97. I mean, he's got certain things which are going for him. He's fighting on home soil. He's got interior lines. He is, dealing with allies who have to converge on Paris across a fairly wide front. Yeah, I mean, he is confident there, and I think, to an extent, that confidence does sort of translate into, or exudes itself and influences, the units fighting under him. I think there is a real difference, when you're fighting really on home soil. I think that does make a difference. Of course, it works against him in that he keeps on slapping down these kind of peace offers which Drennish is sort of pushing in his direction, and he's always one peace offer too late. It's so frustrating when you read about that, and part of me thinks it would have been nice had that regime continued take this offer, but he's overconfident there. That's a weakness, I guess, ultimately.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I think we are beyond our time, and we have, and I think it was a wonderful presentation to kick off our 2 days of virtual conferences. I thank everybody for attending and for the questions that were asked, and I look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow morning. So have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Rick. Thank you.
Thank you.